was starting to feel like a homecoming, seriously, where I think I know half of the people in the audience. President Sparks, thank you for the invitation, the Architectural League, for inviting me to this series. It's well known, well regarded, and I was honored to receive the invitation. There's so many people here who I've admired, who I am in awe of. It's a little nervous to be giving a talk to you because I see my former teachers, I see my former students, colleagues, and long time friends. So just kind of be gentle with me. And I'm bringing what I've coined learning from Detroit, which it was hard to say that a couple of decades ago, but Detroit is in the process of forging a 21st century city that is quite different than many of the cities we look to, like New York or San Francisco, or Boston, but it's a city that has a particular trajectory and of depopulation, not rapid growth, and it requires a different set of strategies, and we have finally moved to a place where people are comfortable with it as a living laboratory, searching for answers, solutions without easy answers, searching for a comeback which is inclusive. And this is a directive from the mayor to try to do something that, as far as we know, no other American city has been able to achieve, and that is to create a recovery that retains those residents who stuck it out with this city. And so you'll see that theme reoccurring in the images that I show. So, why does Detroit matter? Right now, there are a host of reasons. I'll just focus on three. It's really, really big. It matters because of its size. And if you can imagine a city of 139 square miles where you could fit the city of San Francisco, the city of Boston, and the entire island of Manhattan within its limits, you get a sense of its size. It's also big because it was one of the fastest growing cities in the first half of the 20th century, at 1.8 million people at its peak in the 1950s, till today, which just under 700,000 at 680,000 residents. So that's about a loss of about 1.2 million people. So you have to imagine what happens to a city when 1.2 million people up and leave, the structures that they inhabited, the places that they loved. In fact, that growth accelerated from 2004 to 2014, where the city lost 244,000 residents in 10 years. So if those folks had founded a new city, it would be the second largest city in the state of Michigan after Detroit. So this is a very recent history of population loss and a very recent time of despair and an expectation that we were going to watch a great American city die. In fact, the last one out, just please turn off the lights, was a common phrase. And it got to a point in 2013 where the city could no longer pay its bills and filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, with $18 billion of debt having to be forgiven. And there were enormous signs of distress, the population loss over 60%, 36% below the poverty line, emergency vehicles, police arriving an hour after being called, 40% of the street lights not coming on at night. So the one thing that the bankruptcy did was remove this crippling debt on the city and gave it an opportunity for a kind of new life. Detroit is also black. It's over 80% of the population is African American and 10% Latino. But the black population there is a long history of the building of the black middle class in America. These are folks who migrated to Detroit in search of those incredible auto industry jobs that built a robust middle class, that built institutions and built wealth. Detroit had the highest rate of home ownership of African American communities in America during this time. And that population, many, many left, but many, many stayed. So there is a hardcore black middle class that has continued to anchor Detroit during bad times and good. And as I said, it's very unusual to live in a city where 90% of the people are of color. And it's a large city with an incredible sense of resiliency. So when I work in the community, I often come and I encounter people who've been in their homes for 50 and 60 years. And they're house proud. They have a strong sense of self-identity. And they are planning to stay. And that is the population that I've been asked to work with. Detroit is also beautiful. And it has created all kinds of cultural icons that we all know, from giving a generation a soundtrack to iconic figures cultural figures in sports like Joe Lewis. The whole notion of beauty and the automobile, Detroit made that. And it also, with its extraordinary wealth, created an architectural legacy that is really in par with the heyday of high-rises in Manhattan and in Chicago. But that wealth also created gorgeous, gorgeous neighborhoods by the dozens. And these are the typical neighborhoods, truly typical neighborhoods of Detroit, where neighborhoods are anchored by single-family ownership. And each period gave exemplary examples of residential neighborhood building like Lafayette Park, where my wife and I live. But Detroit is also blighted. There are over, at the time, there are over 80,000 vacant structures that were left behind. And very often you'd find blighted structures next to occupied structures, which really eroded anyone's sense of desire to maintain the properties. And it got to the point nationally where a name was invented for Detroit's ruins, ruin porn, where people found this kind of morbid beauty in things like this reappropriation of the Michigan Theater as a parking garage. And it got to the point of absurdity, right, where there's really no more of this left to fetishize. And it also built a kind of resiliency that Detroit is known for. Its working class roots. It's tough, it's resilient, these are the folks who stayed. And in 2014, a year before I arrived there, Mayor Duggan, the first white mayor to be elected in 30 years, was elected by a landslide. And his notion, he was a turnaround specialist, the director of the Detroit Medical Center, and he said, give me 6 months. And we are going to begin to provide those basic services that people expect from a government. And he had one single directive. He wanted to preside over growth again in Detroit for the first time in his lifetime. So much of the mission is how do you grow Detroit while you retain the resident population and create opportunity through that growth. And how to do that? Well, he was incredibly strategic in the team that he assembled to be responsible for that growth. Jed Halbert, who served in the Bloomberg administration here in Manhattan, Arthur Jameson, who was Deval Patrick's Undersecretary for Housing and heads our housing and redevelopment, Madi Touré, who manages real estate for the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, and myself, heading planning and development. And I'm probably the only one who has an academic career of this group, and this was on purpose. Mayor Duggan was attracted to my history of living and working internationally. The idea of an architect being the planning director was not new to me. Massimo Carmasi was a dear friend and colleague in Florence, Italy, and he's an architect who was the planning director of the city of Pisa. And so, while it was strange when I got the call from Mayor Duggan, there was a role model that I could remember. And of course, the differences of working in Europe versus the integration of landscape in the American landscape, and that 17-year period in Charlottesville, Virginia, where, Thomas Jefferson said all wise things. And this one particularly was like a North Star for me that talked about design activity and political thought as being indivisible. That if I was going to have an impact on the world, I was going to have to engage in public service. And for me, some of you know that started as the kind of president of my neighborhood association, and beginning to speak about the things that matter to ordinary people who I lived with, and that led to being elected to a political office as a city councilor and finally as mayor. So there's a mixture of kind of community organizer, grassroots, but also this notion that you need to be in a position of authority if you're going to make change. And I had a number of foundational experiences along the way of working with really ordinary folks who are trying to do extraordinary things, like this rural community in Virginia, Bayview, where we, through our office, worked with folks who had been living in crippling poverty, with outhouses and no indoor plumbing, and turning that effort into a multi-million-dollar affordable housing nonprofit organization that built and owned the community that we designed together at the bottom of the slide. And to this day, they are still there, and they're very, very house proud. And it's an important experience because it showed me that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and collaboratively you can make change happen. Then I had the opportunity to go to New Orleans at the invitation of Dean Schwartz, who's also here tonight, to lead the Tulane City Center. And once again, you can see a mix of advocacy, grassroots advocacy, but also a demand that government do the right thing and play a part. And I had the opportunity to work on dozens of extraordinary projects with nonprofit partners throughout New Orleans that tried to tap into the kind of cultural authenticity of that place and use that as the impetus for change. And I'll just highlight one with the Mardi Gras Indians, which is an incredible group, predominantly of men, who sew together elaborate suits and parade through the city on their days. And their quest to find a way to thread community economic development through their practice, to build institutions, to own land, and to support local culture. And so the gentleman in the center on Super Sunday transforms into this regal figure that parades through the streets of New Orleans. But for us, it was about ownership and assisting them in taking control of their destiny through the ownership of land and through the preservation of that community. And through a $500,000 grant, we were able to assist them to buy the block in front of the park and then become the stewards of that culture. So that's an important window into my approach in Detroit. When I arrived in 2015, actually it will be 3 years in May, I was searching for answers, trying to grasp the extraordinary scale and complexity of working in this environment. And I had to find answers quickly. And so just weeks after arriving, began to try to understand the city in pieces, trying to understand what aspects of this had a systems underpinning. Where do you start? Where do you start? Well, part of it started with building a new planning department, literally from scratch, that could project to residents a sense of security about the future, that could somehow be grounded in the cultural place that they know, and then hopeful. And it wasn't about being hopeful in the future, it was being hopeful like right now. And so we crafted this mission, and but this is what I had to work with. I inherited 6 planners for a city of 680,000 people. And that means like you get one planner for every 113 residents. They each cover a topography about the size of Manhattan. So needless to say, when the mayor asked me what was it going to take to make Detroit a leader in revitalization, I suggested that I needed to hire a lot of people. In fact, 40. And I also was given the opportunity to restructure planning and start literally from scratch. And my first impulse was to create regions, a region on the west, a region on the east and central, each one led by an architect or landscape architect and made up of interdisciplinary players. The other part was building citywide divisions, 5 of them, an Office of Zoning Innovation, an Office of Strategic Planning, Arts and Culture, an Office of Urban Research that would do metrics, GIS, and demographic projecting, an Office of Transportation, and then finally an Office of YES that would manage our philanthropic and higher ed partnerships. The other aspect of building this department was how do you build a department that looked and felt like Detroit? And this has been really important to our success. We built a department where over 60% of the professionals are of color. 55% of them are women in leadership positions. 30% are from Michigan. 70% live in the city. It's the highest percentage of department staff that live in the city, and over 12 languages were spoken. And it's important because a lot of the work that we're asked to do is to mobilize people to tackle things that are extraordinarily difficult, that don't have easy answers, and to have a willingness to give that work back to the people who are directly affected, and then to problem solve according to their values. So what that means is a deep level of engagement at all scales in hundreds of meetings over the course of a year. So I started by saying Detroit is big. And it's important for those who are trying to grasp the scale of this to understand that the amount of public land that is under a single authority owned by the city is the size of the entire island of Manhattan. So 24 square miles of the city is publicly owned, and it's vacant. And so the question becomes, like, what do you do with that? What do you do in the face of the scale and the magnitude of that opportunity? And so this is what it looks like. Vacant up to a point, right? Because there's still tens of thousands of people who live dispersed through that landscape. The landscape is regenerating before our very eyes. So there's something organic and natural about what's happening. And the question is, how do you look at that as a competitive advantage and not a disadvantage? And that has been the pivot that Detroit has made. There have been people who get on their power lawnmower and mow their block. They have become natural stewards of this land. And the challenge we have is how do you allow them to be an equity stakeholder in this recovery in a way that's structured so that it can be successful. So I and my team started looking for a set of characteristics that we thought could be kind of building on strengths. So we looked at the strongest neighborhoods first. We looked at neighborhoods that had 30 or 40% of vacant land that we could operate on a large scale. We looked for areas that had commercial corridors that had become derelict and blighted, but had the framework for something, for a place to be made. All throughout the city. So I have a map that's 14 feet long and 9 feet tall in my office, and we draw the areas that we think should be the focus of the growth and retention. And so at this point, we've identified about 10 to 12 different areas that have a population of about 300,000 that we will be working on over the course of the next few years. And as we test these ideas, we'll take those lessons and apply them to the next series of neighborhoods. So there's a clear trajectory out to 2019 of where we'll be working and how we will be practicing. So it's really important to have a set of concepts when you're tackling things of this scale. So I have long since known and admired the concept of landscape urbanism, very anxious to apply it in a real-world context. So the idea that you could organize a city through the design of the city's landscape rather than the design of its buildings is one foundational concept that you'll see exhibited tonight. The other, this is by Marshall Brown, who teaches at IIT, and his notion of a smooth growth model that doesn't rely on high-density infill development models that we all know, but instead accepts a neighborhood's development as flat and even a negative growth. And once again, that points to a different model for regeneration through the land. And then lastly, this notion of a city in a city. And O.M. Ungers and Rem Koolhaas postulated this in the 70s, really 70s, 80s, that the landscape could be thought of as an archipelago and connecting a series of hyper-dense areas that are where you see growth. And so I'm going to take those three first. This is an image from the Detroit Future City, which was an incredible planning exercise that preceded me. But it talked about the notion, in their particular case, of shrinking the city, but connecting it through a landscape that would emerge over time where there would not be high residency. So I've never bought the idea, nor has Mayor Duggan, that any part of Detroit is going to be left behind. But it was pretty clear that if we were going to look for strategic alignment, that we were going to have to bring in some of the world's and our country's best landscape architects to help us figure that out. And these are just 8 that are currently working in Detroit, from Walter Hood, and from Oakland, Catherine Gufferson of Seattle, Pete Odoff from the Netherlands, Barbara Wilkinson here in New York, Elizabeth Mossop from Sydney, Australia, Michelle Devine from Paris, Kate Orff, SCAPE here in New York, and most recently Michael van Valkenburg. And so it was my belief that not only were some of the answers we were looking for were embedded in that discipline, we also wanted to start in a place that truly signified the concept of bringing the city back with everyone included. And so our big audacious challenge was to try to imagine a continuously public riverfront from Belle Isle to Ambassador Bridge, and to understand that that is 5.5 miles of public riverfront. And you can see it here compared to Battery Park up to Hudson Yards. And it started on the east side, the East Riverfront, and just recently we have announced the creation of a West Riverfront Park. So I want to share those 2 strategies with you. The idea of creating a comprehensive framework for a public landscape and international waterfront that drove real estate development. And Detroit has seen over a 10-year period a riverfront dominated by parking lots and industrial uses to a place that is incredibly vibrant today. And our charge was, how do you look out 30 years and something that could house 20 million square feet of development over time, and how do you do that without an aggressive development pressure on this space. We're still having to induce development. So this is what it looks like. This is the 2 miles towards the east looking at Belle Isle. And you can begin to see the amount of vacant land. And the question is, it's going to take a generation to fill it with buildings. What do you do in the interim? And Michel Devine's notion was to occupy every available open space with an intentional landscape, and to thread that through a series of greenways, most which are pre-existing that need to be reinvested in. So that was one defining strategy. The other is, how do you preserve the incredible diversity that this riverfront embodies? I mean, it is the most diverse place in the region. And how do you do that in a way which is transparent, that engenders a level of trust? And for us, it was by opening up the public process and allowing people to see how these public landscapes are made. And when I suggest opening them up, I mean literally interviewing candidates for the commission in public. And we had 8 extraordinary presentations. About 200 people showed up to hear these 8 notions of what the East Riverfront might be. And SOM out of Chicago, Michel Devine, and then McIntosh Porras locally won this commission. So the expectation that the public would be engaged only increased by that. And we went about discovering as many ways as possible to expose people to the resource, both boat rides, bike trips, tours, walking tours, breakout meetings, socializing people with drawings, and interactive ways of engaging in the work as it was in the process of becoming. And then what came out of it was pretty amazing to me. Each of those white areas you see had previously been slated for private development, condominium development, that, as you could see, would occupy a critical part of an open space system that was evolving. And so the area you see on your left was supposed to be reserved for a building. And as a result of the public process and Michel Devine's notion of filling up that vacant space with an intentional landscape, this became the model. Not just of a landscape, but an ecology that was different, that was transformative, and that was big enough to structure urban development along its perimeter. And so by pushing the development to the sides and creating a great central park on the river, we could begin to test the value that that landscape made to the real estate adjacent to it. And so this notion of a landscape that structures the urban realm is now the framework for the future development. And, I think the Free Press said it best, So the riverfront is not going to be an exclusive domain for high-end condos after all. That it actually is going to be democratic. And it's producing a landscape that is both performative and challenges people and introduces them to a landscape that is in many ways unfamiliar. So the next part is taking that system and moving it further to this 5.5-mile continuous promenade. And so even this site, which will be years before it's developed, negotiating an easement that would allow us to build the last leg that would allow people to get to Belle Isle on foot, and eliminating the edge that separates the promenade from the water, and then using this as a way to begin to structure development. And so what you see is some of the working models that begin to show density towards a major boulevard just north of the riverfront, and then scaling down towards the river. So we were interested in keeping all of the buildings, but finding a way to trigger growth. And so that middle slide represents some of the authentic architectural resources that dot the East Riverfront. And so how do you signal to developers and designers that the intent is not just to restore, but to add, and to add in a contemporary way that increases the density while preserving these assets? And so these were the images that were used to solicit developer-architect collaborations. And so the first building, which is a building owned by the city, the Stone Soap Building, 3 proposals were submitted, and the winning proposal doubled the density, but not only created market rate and affordable housing, but an active market on the ground floor, and a house for a beloved institution, Shakespeare in Detroit, that would become a cultural anchor for what might otherwise been a market rate development. And so it's important for us to show that contemporary architecture can coexist with historic assets and actually amplify their value. The next part of it was, how then do you reach out and grab hold of neighborhoods just north of the riverfront? And we have a beautiful conversion of a former rail called the DeQuindra Cut. Could we use that model that leads you to the riverfront and multiply that by investing in a series of other pre-existing ones, reinvesting in them, and most importantly, creating a kind of gateway for those neighborhoods to the north to access the resource by creating urban places that actually invite people to enter. But it's very important, the notion of taking these existing paths, which pass through predominantly low-income areas, and reinvesting in them a way that made them secure, made them accessible and well-lit, and to do this multiple times. This one is the Beltline Greenway that leads to the Packard plant, and reinvesting in them. So the first public investments on the riverfront will be off the riverfront and in existing neighborhoods, signaling to people that they're going to be a part of this riverfront transformation. So I mentioned the DeQuindra Cut. This is what it looked like 10 years ago, and this is what it looks like today. It has multiple sections that have different characters, a more industrial character as it moves further north. And our notion of, could we take this system and apply it through the city in a loop or circle, passing over highways, and using it as a way to collect and organize development. So this is the Beltline in Atlanta, and we are talking about how you do this both on the east and the west side. But to the west riverfront, this 22-acre park that would be the organizing public space for a series of neighborhoods that do not have a major park on the west side. And this time, how do we take the level of engagement to yet another level? And so, once again, all the interviews are in public. There are opportunities for the public to have exposure and learn about multiple visions. And then, in the case of the West Riverfront, we decided to create a panel of community members, 21 community members, and to fly them around the country to some of the best parks currently in American cities so that they could become the experts and the advocates for design excellence. And they became members who shared their opinions in public, in writing, in outbreak groups, and were a part of the brief, if you will, so that image you see there is before the architects and landscape architects were asked to design anything. There was this engagement with experts at this point in park design. The 4 finalists were GGN, Catherine Gutherson, Michael Van Valkenburg, and David Ajay, Walter Hood, and Field Operation James Corner. And the winning entry, which was announced last week, was Michael Van Valkenburg, whose team, I think, touched on a series of critical components that the community advocated for, like the ability to touch the water by creating this cove that allows for a beach on this bank of the river, but also the idea of honoring active sports. So creating this sports house under a sheltered place. So even honoring the kinds of activities that are commonplace in neighborhoods, or hearing about the fishermen who would fish on the pier and how to create a transformational experience for them in that environment. And so this will be built over the next 3 years, and I'm very excited to have something that is catalytic on both the east and west side. So then the next challenge is to connect all of this. And I talked about a loop. It goes for about 26 miles. So it would go from the riverfront, which would be 5.5 miles, and then continue for another 21 miles, and with the purpose of connecting neighborhoods across the entire geography of Detroit. So taking that off-road greenway system and connecting areas that will be of growth, and then tagging it culturally so that it becomes embedded in the cultural identity of the city. And how we thought to do that was to name it the Joe Lewis Greenway. So that forever, the organizing structure of the city will be known because of this iconic figure in Detroit's identity. And then to add to that structure, connect the neighborhoods east and west through a comprehensive system of protected bike lanes on road. And it's the Motor City, so this one is a tough one to advocate for, but we're getting there. So you can begin to see the notion of the archipelago, the green archipelago, emerging. So I want to drill down a little what happens in this notion of cities within a city, and the notion of a growth which is smooth, and what they mean by that notion of a landscape archipelago is areas that are of higher density, that have all of the things you need for your daily comings and goings, and have that connected by a system of greenways and intentional landscapes that connect it into a whole. So, it begins, obviously, one of the highest density places is the downtown. It's the heart of the city. It's the heart of the recovery. It's the story you've been reading about. It's about the tallest building being built on the beloved site of Hudson Department Store, which is already broken ground. This is a building by shop architects. Or the Monroe Block from the Copenhagen-based firm that talks again about these are mixed-use buildings which inhabit the public space. But it's also about signaling to people that this place belongs to everyone. So you are just as likely to see a pickup basketball game being played in the central square of Detroit as you are a Fridays after 5 cocktail. But the work that I'm here to describe is also about the soul of the city, which resides in neighborhoods. And there are over 200 of them in Detroit. And so our challenge was to take a neighborhood at a time. Not a house at a time, not a street at a time, but a neighborhood at a time. Take that unit and begin to talk about it differently. What would it be like to walk within 20 minutes of your house to all of the services you would need without reliance on a car? And that's the model. And it goes back to that notion of finding a walkable dimension in Detroit. We started with a square mile and went to a half mile, and we finally came to the quarter square mile increment. It's 160 acres. And how to overlay very intentional strategies with the vacant land. So there are about 4 of them that are designed and are moving to implementation. I want to walk you through 2 of them. The first is on Livernois McNichols. It's the Fitzgerald strategy. It's in that box with the blue properties. We call this, it's wedged in between University of Detroit Mercy and Marygrove College. We're calling this the no-build option because we are building no new structures in a quarter square mile, and yet we aspire to transform every single lot. It is bordered by Marygrove and University of Detroit Mercy. There are about 600 households that still live here and about 400 parcels, about 20 acres that are publicly owned. It is, again, the typical Detroit street, tree-lined streets. Some of them are great. Some of them have gaps within them. And could you take that and through a set of strategies of rehabbing homes, of which there are about 115 homes that are vacant and publicly owned, and about 300 vacant lots, and have a intentional strategy for each one of them, one that is dependent on the other. So the rehab, the vacant land is dependent on the rehab, and to bring in one single developer to oversee the regeneration of all of these properties. So it's like a quilt. So the strategy was authored with our landscape architect, Alexa Bush, and the landscape architect, Elizabeth Mossop. And the notion was to gather as many lots in the center to create a multi-acre neighborhood park, to string parcels east and west to create a greenway, and to develop a typology of about 5 different strategies for vacant land according to the number of lots. And, in Detroit, there are hundreds of urban farms. They're usually lot farms. They're usually the land use of last resort. And we postulated what would happen if you brought those into an urbanized area and actually allowed them to be the genesis for the regeneration of the neighborhood. But there would be a design code so that the farmers could basically have a turnkey operation. And so the landscape architect came up with the typologies, with the border perimeter fencing. About 100 of these lots were going to be flowering meadows that you see. So the lot next door to the house that would be rehabbed would come with the renovated house, and one of these flowering meadow gardens would be installed in tandem with the renovation of the house. So that took about 100 of these lots off. Other lots would become hubs of other kinds of activity, either managing stormwater or having neighborhood-based enterprises, and they all would have clues that they are cared for. The lots in the center would become the central park of the neighborhood, which goes across alleys and streets to try to create a comprehensive understanding of what happens when you have 50 lots in a neighborhood. Can that be an intentional public gathering place? And then stringing those random lots together in terms of a greenway that would be bike and pedestrian, connecting both universities through the neighborhood. And the levels of engagement are plentiful. I think there have been over 90 meetings with communities in all forms and fashion to bring them to a place where they feel ownership of this strategy. And it employs local residents. There's a team of about 8 residents that are preparing the installation of these landscapes and will implement and maintain them, working in partnership with the developer. So that's the strategy. It's made up of renovated homes and gardens. And it is currently under construction. It comprises 20 acres and 400 lots. And we're going to wait and see how this works. But we're also not leaving it to chance. There is a clustered investment strategy. So the commercial corridor to the north is being renovated with a new streetscape. New businesses are being prepared to go into retail storefronts. And you can begin to see the components of the strategy. Transformed streetscapes, parks and greenways, commercial mixed-use development on those streets, and then the rehab of houses and landscapes. And now we have 3 other strategies that are in various stages of completion. I want to talk briefly about the other strategy, and that is a strategy that tries to find the missing middle density that Detroit did not build a lot of. And so these are areas that are adjacent to downtown, where the market is going, and yet they don't have a wide range of housing options for families with children, young professionals. So this is literally 5 minutes from downtown. About 60 acres of that land is publicly owned. So the question is, how do you guide that development over the course of years? And how do you build to a density which perhaps, with the lack of public transit, you would not be able to service? Well, they've just inaugurated a streetcar down the center of Woodward that travels right now a little less than 4 miles, but with that single investment has turned those neighborhoods adjacent to it into transit-oriented neighborhoods. So the first project was a very interesting proposal that carried the day, that used the form-based code not to create one monolithic neighborhood type, but a neighborhood that tries to be built in increments. This was one by Bedrock, and it has 5 different architects working through a form-based code. And so the strategy is in a block and a half to have townhouses, carriage houses, duplexes, flats and rehabbed historic structures. And that notion of finding everything between a single-family house and a high-rise within a tight urban area. And this last image of the rehabbed house, I don't know if Camilo ever thought he would see it, but it now anchors this new neighborhood. And more importantly, we wanted to talk about how contemporary architecture could sit side by side with historic structures and build the neighborhood through diversity. So 4 buildings, these are designed by Loha, Lorcan O'Halloran, that allow density to emerge along the primary streets with corner retail to create an internal muse for a more protected environment for families with children. And then could you take this model of multiple designers operating within a small geography and create a set of guidelines and codes that build the density both incrementally and typologically? And so we expanded this study to lay out all of the possible options for density in this neighborhood. And a document which is usually a multi-page document would be reduced to 2 pages. The process of 6 months to get something through would be reduced to 6 weeks. And then we would attach this code to all RFPs for developers. And we tested this idea, and we got what we had hoped for, an inventive, varied expression of density within a historic neighborhood. So the historic part is really important. And lastly, I want to talk about what you do with 80,000 existing buildings and how you begin a strategy to save them. So we have a set of strategies that we're calling SAVED, Structures Adapted for Vital Enterprises in Detroit. And it's built on this intention of, based on the scale that we have to operate, what we have to hold on to. And this broke my heart to have to see the demolition of half of an asset in order to save the other half so that this arena could be built. But the reality is that you're looking at housing 5 minutes from downtown that reach 30 to 40% affordable in the mix. So it begins to assure that we'll have an inclusive recovery in areas like this. So the containers are big. This is the Herman Kiefer Hospital. It was recently purchased by a New York architect developer, Ron Castellano. It's 600,000 square feet, includes 3 schools on 17 acres. So the question is, how do you begin on a project like this? Well, we've begun talking about a tactical approach to historic preservation, where if you can't occupy the full building, could you occupy 2%, 5%, and put a vital use into that that allows it the rest of the asset to be mothballed for another day. And this strategy we're now conceptualizing and applying it to churches, banks, schools, and so on. And so the hope is, by activating the public realm and selectively inserting tactical programs within these buildings, that we can catalyze their redevelopment. But in Detroit, you have things in scale. So there are 42 vacant schools dotted throughout neighborhoods. So these are the neighborhood iconic buildings that should be the first to be reinvested in. And so we are undertaking a comprehensive study to find out which ones should be targeted for full investment now, which ones should be tactically occupied and preserved for further investment later on, and which ones may be beyond disrepair. But so many of these buildings now are finding their reuse as housing, as a mixture of housing and cultural institutions. So when we do a neighborhood plan, there's always a school. We put it out for requests for development proposals. We do the pro forma and advance work, so programmatically we know what goes in them, and they are beginning to seek folks who feel that these are investments that can work. So the strategy inherently has something to do with holding on to the roots of these neighborhoods through their iconic buildings, having a respect for the history of this great American city as your first level investment, acknowledging and respecting nature in all forms, accessible to all people, acknowledging our inherent need for beauty at all ages, diversifying the way in which mobility is understood in cities, respecting the power of local entrepreneurship to populate these commercial corridors, respect for work, the dignity of it at every level, and an acknowledgement that we're doing this for a future generation so that they can plan to stay in Detroit, and an acknowledgement and respect for the community's voice, which ultimately anchors everything you've seen this evening. Thank you.
Great. Maurice, thank you so much for that really inspiring talk. I have a number of questions. I'm not going to ask all of them.
Sure.
But I'd just like to kick it off with maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Great.
But I guess the first thing that just kind of pops into my mind is, given the population decline, and of course, these wonderful strategies aren't going to be all implemented at the same time.
Right.
Will perhaps happen over decades. But I'm wondering, is the city at a point of thinking about its growth in terms of population and making projections in terms of population? And then if so, are there specific areas that are targeted in terms of newcomers' population growth, and what might that sequence be?
Yes. The curve has flattened out. So we now know by tracking that Detroit is starting to grow. We have to wait for the 2020 census to confirm that. But the city is preparing for growth at a rate which is going to be very, very slow. And we hope so that we'll be able to guide it. And so I often go to these cities that are turbocharged for growth, and the design and planning community, are panting, trying to keep up with it and control it. I often am glad that we have a different problem. Ours is, how do we induce growth? How do we manage it? The fact that it's slow allows us to manage it well. So when we talk about growth projections, and when we look at cities like New Orleans or cities like Washington, and we've tracked their growth, and then we look at what if we grew by 1/3 of what DC grew? How many thousands of households would we be trying to accommodate? And where would we want to plan for them to go? Now, clearly, there's the downtown and the downtown adjacent neighborhoods that have all of the kind of amenities that are driving the repopulation of urban areas and cities. But we also have neighborhoods like Livernois McNichols that is literally 7 miles from downtown. So it's going to induce a different kind of growth at a different rate. And so we are planning for each of those areas that we see having significant strengths to build the kinds of houses recreate the kinds of amenities in those neighborhoods that will attract a population. So, I said, we're in most of the neighborhoods that I'm talking about, there is a flat to no growth. So to go into a neighborhood that has 600 households and you have 115 houses that you can re-inhabit, you've just increased that area by 115. And then what's going to drive them to the neighborhood's commercial corridor that they can now walk to, or the neighborhood park? And so that's really the approach. And, obviously there's a concern to manage the quality of development in areas where the market has discovered them. So the East Riverfront, this Brush Park. I mean, we literally are planning the entire neighborhood, so that there is a degree of predictability, that people can begin to measure their investment, understand the quality that will emerge over time. And it's an experiment, and we hope then to take that experiment and then apply it to other neighborhoods where we see the market beginning to grow.
Mayor Duggan has said that he wants an inclusive city, and you presented us with some slides about who's participating in these meetings, discussions, who's on your team. But I'm wondering also about, if there's a discrepancy between what's happening downtown in terms of the sort of regeneration there and then what's happening in the neighborhoods. Of course, it's much slower in terms of growth.
Right.
But how is the city planning to ensure that there's a kind of diversity, if you will, downtown? Like how do you ensure that, that pickup game is going to happen?
Right.
Right, in the public space, and who controls that public space.
Right. Well, ultimately, it's about who lives there.
Yeah.
And creating a context by which it is affordable to live in the downtown or adjacent to downtown. And how to do that is literally hold on to the affordability you have. So there are many buildings that are naturally affordable, and making sure that they don't expire. So there's a big push to hold on to existing affordable housing. And then there is a commitment that any public money that goes into a deal has a minimum requirement of 20% affordable housing. So that is public policy, right? No deals unless you're willing, no public resources unless you're willing to put affordable housing not near the site, but in the building. And we're seeing that play out. And then probably most importantly, the city has made a commitment to raise $250 million to underwrite affordable housing wherever, if it is in those areas that we are anticipating growth. So I think that's the biggest commitment. It's public policy. We have an agency that oversees the implementation of that policy, and we are raising the funds to make sure that it can happen. And it's happening after quite a while of prior administrations just being thrilled that there was any development at all. But now there's a real conscious effort that we have to make sure that the downtown adjacent areas are inclusive, and this is the way that we think we can do it.
I have just maybe one more question, and then we'll open it up. Having been mayor of Charlottesville, I'm wondering what sort of lessons, having been mayor, having run the Mayor's Institute, do you bring to this now that you're, let's say, I won't say on the other side,
right,
but you're working as the sort of, not city architect, but the chief planner. And as we know, every decision that gets made is, it's somehow political. We may not think it is, but so I'm just wondering what do you bring, what experience do you bring in terms of those lessons from your previous lifetimes?
Right. Well, I'm thrilled that I am not the mayor of Detroit. I much rather serve a mayor because he has to deal with a lot of things like public safety and schools and jobs. I just have to work on the built in natural environment. So I feel that focus and clarity I rather enjoy. I mean, we are constantly talking about design. We're constantly talking about excellence. I'm constantly advising him on what these strategies mean and what they will do to fulfill his vision. You can't do this work without the consent of the population. And that's very sobering for designers to hear, that part of the reason why we engage is we need their consent to do things that are transformative, that are innovative. You cannot do it without educating ordinary citizens. So we came into an existing neighborhood and we said we want to plant 100 flowering meadows. You know, you got to work with people to understand that when they wanted a house on every one of those lots, how and why that strategy might be transformative. And we will be at every meeting until folks feel they understand it. And you should hear them talk about it, because they do own it. But the same thing with protected bike lanes. And this is a strategy that people, there's a perception of it as a gentrifier. And yet folks don't know that the demographic that's driving bicycle ridership increases across the country are African American and Latino populations. So giving people that information helps to transform. So you only can do what your constituents will allow you to do. And that's a political lesson. You can push it, because we've seen many politicians do that, and they get elected out of office, right? They get voted out of office. So it's a careful balance. I'm always mindful that everything I do has political implications, and I want to hold on to my job.
But education's a big part of it.
It's key. It's key. It's the reason we do this work, because once we install these strategies, residents are going to have to be the stewards of them, because we're not going to be there forever. And so they have to understand them. It has to be a part of their value system. And it takes time. It's patient work. And you can only go at a rate in which people are willing and able to receive these innovations.
Great. Maybe we have some time for a few questions. Well, I see a hand here. I don't know how this works, if we have a mic or what have you, but...
So I have a question about...
and if you can come to this mic, and I think that's where we have it set up.
Just now you mentioned that you focus on residential build work, but my question is that for growth, it's not only focusing on residential growth, but let's say if I move to Detroit, what would I do? I mean, I would have the nice house to live, a nice park to walk, but then after that, how the proposal can cater for another aspect of growth, like careers or jobs or things like that. I know that that's not your focus, but I just wonder.
No. I mean, I think obviously jobs are at the center of the growth equation. And there's an entire organization that is singularly focused not just on jobs, but the retraining of people for jobs at all different levels. And so thousands of new jobs have been created. The poverty rate has decreased. The household income over the past 4 years has increased. And so we know that it's beginning to work. A lot of times people talk about it, and again, it may be a privilege, but many people find a place that they want to live, and then they look for a job. And I can't tell you how many folks are coming to Detroit based on this incredible spirit and vibe that they have, and they are looking for the work. At the same time, the auto industry still anchors the region, and the concentration of suppliers and those who make up that ecosystem are still very high and robust after the automobile bailout. And so it was recently announced that Ford Motor Company is going to bring their mobility innovation team by the thousands of residents to occupy the largest vacant building in Detroit, which is the Michigan Rail Station, which is going to be transformative for that neighborhood. So jobs are clearly a big piece of it. The challenge that I face is threading employment through everything you saw. So who's going to maintain those landscapes? Those are going to be Detroiters working in the green-collar economy. Who's going to occupy the hundreds of storefronts? Those are local entrepreneurs. Even the houses, we found ways to change their zoning to allow for home-based businesses so that it's highly likely that there will be businesses operating out of homes in that strategy. So it's not jobs with a, big J, it's jobs with a little j, but it is a part of the strategy that we're beginning to craft.
And have you identified particular areas that you want to target for certain industries or certain kinds of businesses to move into?
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other scale that we didn't talk about because there is an enormous resource of industrial buildings that are vacant in Detroit at all scales, and they can house new enterprises. So you have everything from recently New York Times featured Jeffrey Aronson, who envisions a fashion manufacturing industry existing in Detroit. And he is pursuing this doggedly, and they will be in those rehabbed structures. So there's an existing inventory that can be re-inhabited, and of course, we know the scale and size of every single parcel in the 139 square miles, and so we know which ones are, 100 acres, of which there are not many, and which ones are 5 acres to 10 acres, and the scale is largely going to dictate the kind of work that you can begin to develop there. So I know the city, the mayor is sort of singularly focused on this, and I have to be mindful when we talk about parks that we're always talking about parks and development. When we're talking about renovating a house, we're talking about renovating a house and a lot next door as a way to begin to thread those two together.
Hi, thank you. I work for the New York City Department of Transportation, and of course I'm thrilled about mobility, walking, biking, but given the manufacturing that's been traditionally in your city, how are you thinking and integrating self-driving vehicles into your planning?
Yeah. We have a division on mobility that works with the auto industries that are principally General Motors, but others that are planning to test driverless vehicles. And part of Ford's strategy of moving their mobility team into Detroit is to advance this. But it's really not just like driverless vehicles. It's also, other modes like Lyft and Uber. General Motors, I think, has a majority share of Lyft. And we're piloting first mile, last mile use of those car services as a way to augment the public transit. So you may have a trunk line express bus, but to go from the express bus to your house, you're using Uber or Lyft. So these kinds of experiments we're just beginning to formulate them. So the bicycle infrastructure, off-road and greenway, is probably the low-hanging fruit of what will be done, but we're putting on the ballot a millage this November to fund mass transit. It will be the second time since I've been in Detroit that the public is being asked for a multi-billion-dollar investment in a regional transportation system. It's going to be key to the long-term sustainability and attractiveness of the region, for sure.
I just want to, is it affecting the form of the landscape as well, the thinking of that?
I would argue that the geography, that the city hasn't shrunk, so we still have to service 139 square miles. But what we have been able to do is create these nodes of higher density, mixed-use neighborhoods. That's the goal. And, currently I said about a third of the population resides in those areas, and we're trying to create those amenities that will make those neighborhoods complete and then have them connected by transit, multiple forms of transit. That's the long-term goal. Of course, the other part, which I always get, is like, what about the rest of the city? And how are you beginning to think about creating a quality of life for residents who live in lower populated areas? The mayor absolutely wanted me, the directive was to build from strengths and show that you can produce some successes. Every single neighborhood in Detroit has vacant land, so test 20 acres before you test 200 acres. But now we're at a place where he's given us the directive to try to envision another form of neighborhood that would have about 100 acres that has to be activated. And what is the business model before the design? And that's a project that Kate Orff of SCAPE is helping us conceptualize with a pretty awesome real estate development team. And so we will, just like the Fitzgerald neighborhood, we will test this idea. That was an idea we had 2 years ago. We're now doing it in 10 different neighborhoods, authored by 10 different design teams, so each one is different from the other. And our goal is to take this lower occupancy in the area, test a series of ideas, and then multiply that. And then, as you could see, over time, we will have a set of strategies that I think have never been explored in contemporary cities like Detroit. That's the longer-term plan. Yeah.
Any other questions?
One final question. In a lot of cities, obviously, people in planning, architecture, real estate, they get pushback.
Yes.
After listening to this, obviously you seem incredibly optimistic. Are you getting pushback from the community, even though this vision seems so exciting?
Yeah, like every day. Like the texts I was getting this morning from the city council that's trying to undo an urban plaza that we created. It is constant. It inspires me to try to find a way to be more persuasive, because I can take nothing for granted. I cannot take for granted that protected bike lanes that take away from vehicular access is a good thing. I can't take it for granted. I can't take for granted that high school students will ride bikes if they have a safe network of bicycle infrastructure. I cannot take it for granted. So I find myself and our team explaining the basic value proposition of a well-designed city at every level. And that's just the way it is, because we have a lot of people to convert. So the mayor is going to be having a town hall meeting. We want to put in 10 miles of protected bike lanes on a major street. He asked us to have at least a dozen preliminary meetings before that meeting so that he can understand, so that people in the audience will understand what he is going to talk about, because he is going to try to convince them that this is a good thing for the quality of life. And so you get pushback, and that's just one more reason why you have to unpack it. You have to be articulate. You have to be persuasive. You have to be passionate. And you have to be authentic. And I think people, when they hear me talk about it, they understand that I am empathetic to their quality of life. And so that's all I can do is just keep, preaching the gospel, talking about excellence, talking about how much they deserve excellence. And you know what? People get it. They really, really get it. So I accept the pushback. If it's going to take 90 meetings to get you to see the vision, I will be there. It's that kind of thing. So. Yes. I'm sorry.
Detroit is a fantastic program. In charge of your presentation and more things. Detroit is at hand, the West, let's say, is the Detroit River. Mm-hmm. You're talking about energizing both the edge of the river and bringing energy to the city. And of course, there's a loop system and urbanism. What have you thought about the pits? What have you thought about defining Detroit, finding a way, making it an exceptional place, perhaps by a green belt along the edge? Or using the fingers to be the bridge out and draw pull people into the city.
I mean, I love the hand. That's a new one, because the hand in the river. I like that. The strategies, the areas that I showed where we are working, all touch, the majority of them touch the edges of the city. And that was by design. The mayor wanted me to get as far away from downtown as possible and show that neighborhoods that are not just adjacent to downtown can regenerate. So when you saw the model, literally the majority of those areas that are now our focus touch the borders. The question of whether you are activating the tip or whether the way the diagram is really shown, which is activating it somewhere towards the center, which is the Joe Lewis Greenway, I would argue is that strap that you're looking for that holds all those pieces together. Their 8 Mile is a hard line between Detroit and the Detroit metro area, and it's a racial line. It just flips from 80% African American to 80% white at that point. And so it's a difficult line to blur in Detroit. And as I said, we've got 139 square miles of city to figure out, and we've got a land resource the size of the island of Manhattan. So I often, while I think about, that other side, I'm mostly focused on how to make that an intentional system. Yeah.
Great. Director Cox. The city that I'm most familiar with is Baltimore, Maryland, where I was director for a couple of years. Huh. And similar to Detroit, we had depopulation and disinvestment. And one of our biggest challenges that I found were the challenge of working between well-intentioned visions that might conflict, particularly the historic preservation community had armored up and established very rigid regulations protecting structures with the best of intentions. I notice in your plan a lot of really innovative adaptations of structures which frankly our community would have objected to. I was wondering if you could talk about how you built trust with that community and were able to develop a degree of flexibility in interpretation.
No, thank you for that question. Well, first of all, we hired a lot of historic preservationists on staff. So we have 5 people who work in historic preservation. We have a cultural historian on staff. And so when we go into a neighborhood, we conduct oral history interviews. We film them so that one image of a man talking about living in his neighborhood, that's a part of our normal practice of mining residents for the roots of their neighborhood and honoring that. And it turns out most of these folks are kind of informally preservationists. I mean, they have held these neighborhoods together when everyone else abandoned them. So they're a natural constituency for historic, for preservation. So we are operating at that level. We're trying to change the conversation of blight by operating tactically in some portion of those assets that people love, like the high school they went to or the elementary school they went to. So when we do a neighborhood plan, we take an inventory. We have historic preservation architects as a part of the interdisciplinary team. And we're doing 2 right now where the entire neighborhood is being looked at as a conservation district, so that we can put together a set of tools and ways that they can manage it without the heavy regulation of being an historic district. So I just I remember when I first mentioned in public that Detroit shouldn't build any more single-family houses, that there should be a moratorium until we have occupied every historic house that we have. And that got an applause from the ordinary residents who understood the inherent value of their neighborhood fabric and how housing that had come into the neighborhood had largely eroded that quality. So I think while they may not be preservations, I think inherently they are, and that makes the conversation a lot easier.
Excuse me, this is a quick question, and this is actually a pretty good segue. I'm just wondering, how many other cities are looking to Detroit for ideas? I know every city is different. As I said, this was a pretty good segue into just this notion of how many cities do you think might follow somewhat of what your plan is? Well,
I think Detroit is an extraordinary laboratory for the concept of landscapes as structures, ways of restructuring cities. So you have to have some land to work with. So Baltimore, clearly, our staffs have been in contact. They visited our office. Buffalo, New York, constant conversation with them. So they tend to be cities that have a land resource, but they have no creative strategies for how to repurpose them. And so I started by looking at all the cities that had lost population, and I was looking for answers. And lo and behold, I found no easy answers. In fact, I couldn't find an American city that had invested millions of dollars in 20 acres of vacant land that wasn't necessarily a new park. And so we're going to be the first to do it. And we think that it's going to be a lot easier to scale down than to scale up. So if Detroit is doing it at 20 acres, and that's the first out, we have another one that's 40 acres that's based on a tree nursery model. It'll be a lot easier for other communities to take that 20 acres and scale it at 5 than the other way around. So I think as we come up with answers, more communities will be looking to Detroit for a land-based strategy for regeneration. That's my expectation.
And could you, a quick follow-up, how does the climate affect the acceptability of utilizing the land in a way to grow things?
Yeah, I mean, we have to deal with winter months and what happens when you do a tree nursery when you have to move the plant material into hoop houses. That's just a kind of reality. Or what does a flowering meadow look like in all seasons of the year? Right. And, Pete Odoff is doing a multi-acre garden. And as you probably know, his gardens look absolutely gorgeous during the winter as well as other seasons. But we take in seasonality. I don't know if you noticed that in each of those strategies for the riverfront, there was a winter view. Because we know winters are fierce. It was snowing this morning in, Michigan, in Detroit. So it's just a part of, the seasons. And the landscapes have to look intentional at all times of the year. The fencing, the perimeter, the border, all being designed by the landscape architects so that even the fencing will look good during the off-season. So,
Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice, for this very inspiring
Thank you all.